I never recommend trying to figure out your scores with anyone outside of the clinician who assessed you. And the reason for that is they not only have firsthand knowledge of the data that they gathered from the assessment, they can actually help you apply your scores in an everyday experience, an everyday setting. One of the things that I absolutely love about neuropsych, there is a woman who looked at test data in relation to the individual's performance. And she called this process or this method the Boston process approach, where you look at a person's overall test scores and you compare those scores to themselves, not just to the norm or everyone else of the same age, relation, etc. It's really about looking at how did the individual do in relation to themselves. And in doing that, she was able to really understand that people have not just their own strengths, but they have their own elevations and own challenges. And looking at it in relation to themselves, not just in relation to the norm, really helped people understand why, for example, someone who had a intellectual deficit or MR at the time diagnosis were still able to function really well across various tasks where most people would assume they wouldn't be able to. Well, they could, not because they had the cognitive capacity to, but rather because they were well-versed or trained in a particular task that supported them in doing that task. So sometimes those numbers, even though they will say average, or even though they might say low average, it doesn't necessarily reflect that that is going to be what the person's ability is going to be. It's not going to be the exact same as everyone in that cohort. So it's up to the clinician who's doing the testing and the individual who is in that testing to really talk about what do those scores mean. Because while we use them as information, they're not the end all be all. They are part of a series, part of a battery that help us to understand how this person can potentially function. But also we do history, we do observation, we gather information about their premorbid functioning, about their functioning, so that we can assess whether or not these scores are really reflective. Sometimes we will do an assessment and we'll find that the scores don't necessarily reflect their functioning. Is it a problem of the testing, or is it a problem of the individual? Like, are they attempting to look a certain way? So we really have to take our time as clinicians and really make sure that what we're seeing fits a particular pattern based on the history, based on the observation, based on a collateral input. It's not just about the numbers. And the reason, again, while I say don't just Google or use any other search engine or this website that will tell you what your scores are, it's because they didn't do the testing. They don't have the history. They don't have the background or the collateral meetings to help inform what these numbers are in relation to that individual. And that's key. It's not simply go take a test. It's a matter of conversation. It's a matter of being able to integrate all of that information that you've gathered and make it into a coherent narrative that is understood in a way that the client can digest. And as I talked about in the beginning, I would talk about understanding and digesting. Understanding happens in the first part of feedback, where you share the data, you share the numbers, and it's like, okay, I understand, I get it. Digesting is when it hits you generally a day or so or a couple of days later, and you start to understand, what does this mean when it is applied to me? Does this mean I have certain limitations? And in some cases that may be true. Does this mean that I should be able to be doing more? And in some cases that may be true. But that digestion is not something that happens immediately. It takes a little bit of time, and it takes a little bit of being removed from, I think, the feedback session to take the space to really read it and come to your own understanding, and then come back with questions. I always encourage people to come back with questions. The information is not always easy to digest. So I do think that time for digestion has to occur, and it has to be met with those questions, and that the clinician should come back and discuss what this information is, usually a second time. In my experience, 2 to 3 sessions is generally what we do in terms of feedback, because it tends to be a lot of information. We're looking at all areas of functioning and really discussing what it's going to look like for the person going forward, how that might impact their work environment, how it could impact learning or a school academic environment, whether accommodations might be necessary. So we really look at all of those scores to help people think about, how do you then move forward? How do you use this information and apply it going forward?